March 1915. A wrecking crew stands before what would become the most expensive demolition in Detroit history, but they're not here yet. Right now, they're building, and what they're building will make some men richer than kings, while condemning others to watch their fortunes crumble into dust. Woodward Avenue, 1915. More millionaires per capita than any street in America, and the numbers prove it. Walk north from downtown and count the limestone facades, the iron gates guarding formal gardens, the entire city blocks owned by single families who decided the internal combustion engine would reshape civilization. They were right. The Dodge Mansion commanded 110 rooms, not bedrooms, rooms. The Fisher Estate sprawled across 6 city lots, each one larger than most Americans would own in a lifetime. The Whitney House, completed in 1894, cost $400,000. Adjust that for inflation, and you're looking at over $14 million in today's money. For one house, one family. But here's what matters. This wasn't inherited wealth. This wasn't old money playing at refinement. These were men who arrived in Detroit with nothing, who saw an opportunity in a machine that barely worked, and who built empires so fast the mansions couldn't keep pace with the bank accounts. Picture the scale. John Dodge's personal fortune in 1920 reached $140 million. That's roughly $2.3 billion today. His brother Horace matched him dollar for dollar. The Fisher brothers, all 7 of them, controlled the body manufacturing for nearly every car rolling off every line in America. When you bought a car, any car, Fisher money touched the transaction. The architecture reflected the speed of accumulation. Italian marble shipped across the Atlantic. Tiffany glass commissioned for private ballrooms. Oak paneling carved by European craftsmen and reassembled in Michigan. The Whitney House featured 10 fireplaces, each one different, each one a statement. The Dodge residence installed a pipe organ that cost more than most Detroit workers earned in a decade. Stand on Woodward Avenue in 1915 and understand what you're seeing. This isn't just wealth. This is the physical manifestation of an industrial revolution happening faster than any in human history. 15 years earlier, cars were experimental toys. Now fortunes measured in hundreds of millions rose from assembly lines that didn't exist when the century began. Boston Boulevard became a corridor of power. East Jefferson attracted those who wanted water views with their wealth. The mansions weren't scattered randomly. They clustered deliberately, creating visible boundaries between those who owned the means of production and those who operated the machinery. The Italian stonemasons laying the marble earned $3 a day. The men who owned the houses paid that much for a single cigar. Every stone, every carved banister, every imported chandelier represented someone else's labor, compressed and transformed into architectural permanence. By 1915, Detroit had become the engine of American mobility, and these mansions were the monuments to that transformation. But empires built this fast rarely stand forever. The same speed that created this concentration of wealth would eventually tear it apart. The question wasn't whether these fortunes would last. The question was what would remain when they fell. March 1915. A wrecking crew stands before what would become the most expensive demolition in Detroit history, but they're not here yet. Right now they're building, and what they're building will make some men richer than kings, while condemning others to watch their fortunes crumble into dust. Woodward Avenue, 1915. More millionaires per capita than any street in America, and the numbers prove it. Walk north from downtown and count the limestone facades, the iron gates guarding formal gardens, the entire city blocks owned by single families who decided the internal combustion engine would reshape civilization. They were right. The Dodge Mansion commanded 110 rooms. Not bedrooms, rooms. The Fisher Estate sprawled across 6 city lots, each one larger than most Americans would own in a lifetime. The Whitney House, completed in 1894, cost $400,000. Adjust that for inflation, and you're looking at over $14 million in today's money for one house, one family. But here's what matters. This wasn't inherited wealth. This wasn't old money playing at refinement. These were men who arrived in Detroit with nothing, who saw an opportunity in a machine that barely worked, and who built empires so fast the mansions couldn't keep pace with the bank accounts. Picture the scale. John Dodge's personal fortune in 1920 reached $140 million. That's roughly $2.3 billion today. His brother Horace matched him dollar for dollar. The Fisher brothers, all 7 of them, controlled the body manufacturing for nearly every car rolling off every line in America. When you bought a car, any car, Fisher money touched the transaction. The architecture reflected the speed of accumulation. Italian marble shipped across the Atlantic. Tiffany glass commissioned for private ballrooms. Oak paneling carved by European craftsmen and reassembled in Michigan. The Whitney House featured 10 fireplaces, each one different, each one a statement. The Dodge residence installed a pipe organ that cost more than most Detroit workers earned in a decade. Stand on Woodward Avenue in 1915 and understand what you're seeing. This isn't just wealth. This is the physical manifestation of an industrial revolution happening faster than any in human history. 15 years earlier, cars were experimental toys. Now fortunes measured in hundreds of millions rose from assembly lines that didn't exist when the century began. Boston Boulevard became a corridor of power. East Jefferson attracted those who wanted water views with their wealth. The mansions weren't scattered randomly. They clustered deliberately, creating visible boundaries between those who owned the means of production and those who operated the machinery. The Italian stonemasons laying the marble earned $3 a day. The men who owned the houses paid that much for a single cigar. Every stone, every carved banister, every imported chandelier represented someone else's labor, compressed and transformed into architectural permanence. By 1915, Detroit had become the engine of American mobility, and these mansions were the monuments to that transformation. But empires built this fast rarely stand forever. The same speed that created this concentration of wealth would eventually tear it apart. The question wasn't whether these fortunes would last. The question was, what would remain when they fell? Rewind to 1900. Detroit's population sits at 285,000. The automobile is a curiosity, a plaything for tinkerers. Henry Ford is a 40-year-old engineer with a failed car company behind him. The Dodge brothers run a machine shop. The Fisher brothers are building carriages. Nobody's getting rich yet. Then everything accelerates. 1903. Ford Motor Company incorporates with 12 investors and $28,000 in cash. The Model A sells for $850. Production? 1,650 cars in 15 months. Respectable, but hardly revolutionary. Geography made Detroit inevitable. Iron ore flowed down from Minnesota's Mesabi Range through the Great Lakes. Coal arrived from Pennsylvania. The waterways allowed cheap transport of raw materials. Railroad lines connected the city to every major market in America. When the automobile industry needed a home, Detroit offered every advantage. Ford's Highland Park plant changed everything. 1913, the moving assembly line. Before this innovation, building one Model T took 12 hours. After, 93 minutes. Production exploded from 82,000 cars in 1912 to over 300,000 by 1914. The wages followed the revolution. January 1914. Ford announces $5 a day for factory workers, double the industry standard. The newspapers call him insane. Economists predict bankruptcy. Instead, workers flood Detroit. The city can't build housing fast enough. The Dodge brothers saw the opportunity earlier than most. They'd been manufacturing components for Ford since 1903, building engines and transmissions in their Hamtramck plant. By 1914, they were earning millions annually just from Ford contracts. Then they decided to build their own car. Ford tried to cut their dividends to prevent the competition. They sued. They won. 1919 judgment. $25 million, the largest civil verdict in American history at that time. The Fisher brothers controlled a different choke point. Every car needs a body. The Fishers perfected closed body construction, moving beyond open carriages to weather-resistant passenger compartments. By 1919, Fisher Body supplied 60% of all car manufacturers. General Motors eventually paid $208 million to acquire the company in 1926, making each Fisher brother extraordinarily wealthy. The statistics tell the story. Detroit's population in 1910, 465,000. By 1920, 993,000. In one decade, the city more than doubled. Housing construction couldn't match demand. Neighborhoods expanded outward in every direction. Streetcar lines extended miles into former farmland. Factory employment drove everything. Packard Motor employed 10,000 workers by 1915. Dodge employed 21,000 by 1920. Ford's River Rouge plant, begun in 1917, would eventually employ 100,000. These weren't seasonal jobs or temporary positions. These were careers, with wages that allowed workers to buy the products they assembled. The wealthy didn't just profit from car sales. They owned the component suppliers, the steel mills, the glass factories. They held patents on crucial technologies. They controlled the dealer networks. Every car sold generated revenue streams that flowed back to Detroit's Mansion District. But the speed created vulnerabilities. An industry built this fast depended on continuous growth, steady demand, and stable labor relations. The moment any of those factors shifted, the entire structure would face pressure. And pressure, when applied to something built so quickly, finds the cracks. The mansions rose between 1910 and 1929, and they rose fast. Horace Dodge didn't wait to see if his fortune would last. He built Rose Terrace in Grosse Pointe, completed in 1910. The house cost over $1 million, 70 rooms, waterfront property stretching 300 feet along Lake St. Clair. Imported Turkish rugs, hand-painted ceilings, a yacht dock with a dedicated boathouse larger than most family homes. John Dodge built his Boston Boulevard mansion in 1917. 110 rooms weren't enough for living. They were a statement. The home featured a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests. The greenhouse alone covered 15,000 square feet, maintaining tropical plants in Michigan's winter. The Fisher Mansion, constructed between 1927 and 1928 on West Boston Boulevard, pushed architectural excess to new heights. Frederick Fisher spent $3 million, roughly $50 million today. The ballroom featured gold leaf covering the ceiling, crystal chandeliers imported from Austria, and a theatrical stage with professional lighting. The house included a bowling alley, a pipe organ, and marble bathrooms with solid gold fixtures. David Whitney Jr.'s home at 421 Woodward Avenue, finished in 1894, set the standard earlier. The architect was Gordon Lloyd. 52 rooms spread across 21,000 square feet. Tiffany stained glass windows depicting different themes for each major room. A secret vault built into the walls. Carved oak throughout, sourced from Europe, and reassembled by craftsmen who spent 3 years on the interior alone. Walk through any of these estates and notice what the architecture reveals. Multiple staircases, because servants couldn't use the same stairs as family. Service hallways hidden behind walls, allowing staff to move invisibly. Kitchens located far from dining rooms to keep cooking smells away from guests. The wealthy didn't just live separately from workers. They designed spaces where workers existed but remained unseen. The labor behind the grandeur tells another story. Italian stonemasons arrived in Detroit specifically for mansion construction. They earned $3 to $4 a day, working 6 days a week. A master craftsman might see $20 for a full week's labor. Meanwhile, the owners spent that amount on a single dinner party. The imported materials created their own economy. Marble from Italy, slate from Vermont, limestone from Indiana. Each mansion required hundreds of tons of stone, carved to specification. Oak paneling came from dismantled European monasteries and manor houses. The wealthy bought history itself, shipping it across the Atlantic and installing it in Michigan. Boston Boulevard became the most concentrated display of automotive wealth. Between 1890 and 1930, over 80 mansions lined this single street. Architects competed for commissions. Italian Renaissance sat beside Tudor Revival, which neighbored French chateau styling. The variety mattered less than the scale. Every house announced its owner's success through sheer size. East Jefferson attracted those who wanted distance from downtown. The avenue stretched along the Detroit River, offering water views and easy access to yacht clubs. The Alger House, built in 1896, featured a private dock. The Joy House, completed in 1908, included grounds large enough for tennis courts and formal gardens that required a full-time staff of 6 gardeners. But the timing contained its own warning. The Fisher Mansion was completed in 1928, 1 year before the stock market crashed, 3 years before the Depression devastated Detroit. The gold leaf ceiling would still shine, but the parties would stop. The ballroom would fall silent. The house represented the peak, built at the exact moment before the fall. These weren't just homes. They were monuments to an industrial age that assumed growth would continue forever, that the assembly lines would never stop, that the money would keep flowing as reliably as the Detroit River. The architecture froze that confidence in stone and marble. And when that confidence proved misplaced, the houses would remain, evidence of wealth that once seemed permanent but proved temporary. The cracks appeared before the mansions were finished, 1920 to 1921. A recession hit the automotive industry hard. Car sales dropped 46% in a single year. Ford laid off 60,000 workers. Smaller manufacturers went bankrupt. The wealthy noticed something troubling. Prosperity wasn't guaranteed. Then came the demographic shift that would reshape everything. Between 1910 and 1930, over 400,000 Black Americans migrated from the South to Detroit, seeking factory jobs that paid real wages. They found work. They didn't find housing. Restrictive covenants became the weapon of choice. Property deeds included language prohibiting sale or rental to Black families. The practice was legal, widespread, and brutally effective. Neighborhoods with million-dollar mansions sat blocks away from overcrowded districts where Black workers paid inflated rent for substandard housing. Dr. Ossian Sweet learned this reality in September 1925. A successful physician, he purchased a home on Garland Avenue in a white neighborhood. He paid in cash. He had every legal right to the property. On his second night in the house, a mob of over 1,000 people surrounded his home, throwing rocks and shouting threats. Sweet and his family defended themselves. Shots fired from inside the house killed one white man and wounded another. Sweet, his wife, and 9 others were arrested and charged with murder. The trial became national news. Clarence Darrow handled the defense. The all-white jury eventually acquitted Sweet, but the message was clear. Cross the color line at your own risk. The wealthy were already leaving, not because of the Sweet case specifically, but because Detroit itself was changing in ways that made them uncomfortable. Grosse Pointe incorporated as a separate city in 1918. Bloomfield Hills followed. Birmingham, Beverly Hills, Huntington Woods. Each new municipality created its own government, its own police force, its own zoning laws. The pattern was deliberate. Establish residency requirements. Zone for large lots that only the wealthy could afford. Grosse Pointe's 5 separate municipalities developed point systems for evaluating potential residents. The systems rated applicants on ancestry, accent, and appearance. Jews received lower scores. Catholics faced scrutiny. Black applicants were automatically rejected. By 1930, the exodus had begun in earnest. The Dodge family maintained Rose Terrace but spent increasing time elsewhere. Horace Dodge died in 1920. His widow remarried and eventually sold the estate. The Boston Boulevard mansions started their transformation. Some became boarding houses. Others converted to offices or funeral homes. The economic pressure was building from multiple directions. Property taxes on mansions designed for single families became burdensome. Maintaining 70-room estates required full-time staff. The Depression was coming, though nobody knew it yet. The 1929 crash was still ahead, but the foundation was cracking. Consider what was happening simultaneously. The wealthy moving to segregated suburbs. Black workers trapped in overcrowded neighborhoods by legal restrictions. Factory employment still strong but vulnerable to economic downturns. Property values in the city beginning to decline while suburban land increased in worth. The physical separation of races and classes becoming institutionalized through municipal boundaries. The mansions built as permanent monuments were already becoming temporary residences. The Fisher Mansion's Gold Leaf Ballroom hosted fewer parties. The Whitney House, its owner deceased, faced an uncertain future. The Dodge Mansion on Boston Boulevard would stand for decades more, but its purpose was already shifting. Here's what matters. The decline didn't start with the Depression. It started with choice. The choice to abandon the city for separate municipalities. The choice to use legal tools to enforce segregation. The choice to prioritize separation over shared prosperity. The violence against Ossian Sweet wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview of what happened when growth stopped and resources had to be divided rather than expanded. The mansions were monuments to growth. But growth had already slowed, and when it stopped completely, those monuments would become something else entirely, something nobody building them in 1920 could have imagined. October 1929. The stock market collapsed, and Detroit's illusion of permanence collapsed with it. By 1932, unemployment in the city reached 50%. Half the workforce had no jobs. The assembly lines that built fortunes in 15 years fell silent in 15 months. Ford's River Rouge plant, which employed over 100,000 workers at peak production, cut its workforce to 37,000. Packard eliminated 2/3 of its employees. Smaller manufacturers simply closed. The machinery didn't disappear. The factories still stood. But without buyers for cars, the entire economic structure froze. Bank failures wiped out savings overnight. Guardian Detroit Union Group collapsed in February 1933, taking 40,000 depositors with it. First National Bank followed. People who had worked 20 years, saving carefully, woke up with nothing. The mansions on Boston Boulevard faced a new reality. Their owners had money in failed banks. 2. Walk through Detroit in 1933 and see the transformation. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families evicted from homes they'd owned for decades carried their possessions onto sidewalks. The Dodge Mansion, that 110-room monument to automotive wealth, was subdivided into apartments. Strangers lived in spaces designed for a single family and their servants. The human cost showed in the statistics. Detroit's relief rolls in 1933 included over 250,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. These weren't seasonal unemployed. These were skilled workers, craftsmen, engineers with nowhere to apply their skills. The industry that created the fastest wealth accumulation in American history now created the fastest poverty expansion. Then came 1941, Pearl Harbor. And suddenly, Detroit had a purpose again. The arsenal of democracy. The same factories that built luxury cars, retooled for war production. Ford's Willow Run plant produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. Chrysler built tanks. Packard manufactured engines for PT boats. Employment surged. By 1943, Detroit's factories employed over 300,000 workers in defense contracts. Wages rose. Overtime became standard. The bread lines disappeared, replaced by crowds outside factory gates competing for shifts. The Depression lifted, not through policy or recovery, but through war demand. But the revival was temporary, and everyone knew it. The defense contracts had end dates. The bomber production that saved Detroit in 1942 would stop the moment the war ended. And it did. August 1945. Victory over Japan. By December, 75,000 defense workers in Detroit had lost their jobs. The returning veterans faced a housing crisis worse than the 1920s. 500,000 people had moved to Detroit during the war for factory work. The city hadn't built housing for them. Now veterans came home expecting places to live, and there was nowhere to put them. The tension over limited housing brought racial conflict back to the surface. The Sojourner Truth Housing Project riot in 1942 showed what was coming. Federal housing built for black defense workers sparked white resistance. 1,000 white protesters tried to prevent black families from moving in. Violence erupted. State troops were deployed. The pattern from the Ossian Sweet case repeated, but on a larger scale. June 1943. The Belle Isle Riot. A fight on a bridge escalated into citywide violence. 34 people died, 25 of them black. Federal troops occupied Detroit for a week. The riot revealed something critical. The wartime prosperity hadn't resolved the underlying tensions. It had only postponed them. The mansions during this period existed in limbo. Some served as offices for war production companies. Others remained subdivided into apartments. A few wealthy families held on, maintaining their properties through economic chaos and war. But the writing was visible to anyone paying attention. The city that built these monuments was fragmenting. The wealth was flowing outward to the suburbs. The defense contracts were ending. Detroit had survived the Depression through war production, but peace brought its own crisis. And this one wouldn't be solved by another external shock. This one would have to be solved internally, through choices about housing, employment, and who belonged in the city. Those choices would determine whether the mansions survived or fell. 1950. Detroit's population peaks at 1,849,568, the highest it would ever reach. The number itself was already a lie. The people were leaving even as the census counted them. The Federal Housing Administration made the exodus possible. Starting in 1934, the FHA insured mortgages for suburban homes while explicitly refusing to back loans in urban neighborhoods with black residents. The practice had a name: redlining. Maps of Detroit were color-coded. Green meant safe for investment. Red meant hazardous. Every neighborhood with significant black population was marked red. The maps became self-fulfilling prophecies. Banks wouldn't lend in red zones. Property values declined. Maintenance suffered. The decline validated the original rating, creating a cycle of disinvestment that would last decades. Veterans Administration loans accelerated the pattern. Returning soldiers could buy suburban homes with zero down payment and 30-year mortgages at 4% interest. The suburbs offered something else: new construction, larger lots, modern amenities. and racial homogeneity enforced through deed restrictions and unspoken agreements. The numbers tell the story of white flight better than any narrative. Between 1950 and 1960, Detroit's white population dropped by 180,000, while the black population increased by 182,000. The total remained roughly stable, but the composition shifted dramatically, and with it the tax base. Then came the highways. Interstate 75 and the Lodge Freeway, constructed through the 1950s and 60s, physically carved Detroit into fragments. The routes weren't chosen randomly. Black Bottom, a thriving black neighborhood, was demolished for I-75. Paradise Valley, the center of black cultural and business life, was destroyed for urban renewal projects. The highways made suburban commutes faster. A family could live in Birmingham or Royal Oak and drive to downtown jobs in 30 minutes. The suburbs got the tax revenue from residential property. Detroit kept the cost of maintaining infrastructure and services. The mansions responded to these pressures in different ways. The Fisher Mansion became a Hare Krishna temple and cultural center in 1975. The Whitney House transitioned into a restaurant in 1986, preserving the interior while converting its purpose. The Motown Museum, Berry Gordy's former mansion on West Grand Boulevard, became a tourist destination, but most didn't survive as recognizable structures. Rose Terrace, Horace Dodge's lakefront palace, was demolished in 1976. The decision wasn't architectural. The estate had been maintained, but Grosse Pointe Shores wanted the land for different development. 70 rooms, $1 million 1910 construction cost, waterfront property, demolished in 2 weeks. The Dodge Mansion on Boston Boulevard stood longer but faced similar pressure. Divided into apartments, the interior deteriorated. Original features were removed or damaged. By the 1960s, the house that represented peak automotive wealth had become subsidized housing. The irony was thick enough to measure. Other Boston Boulevard mansions followed varying paths. Some were purchased by the city and converted to administrative offices. Others became funeral homes, a use that required minimal renovation since the buildings already featured large rooms for gatherings. A few remained private residences maintained by families who refused to leave despite the neighborhood's transformation. The broader pattern was clear. As white residents left, businesses followed. Grocery stores closed in Detroit and opened in the suburbs. Department stores like Hudson's maintained downtown presence but expanded suburban locations. The tax base that funded city services was relocating to separate municipalities. Detroit, in 1960, covered 139 square miles. The population was declining, but the city still had to provide police, fire, street maintenance, and utilities across the entire area. The cost per resident was increasing as the revenue decreased. Basic mathematics predicted what would happen next. The mansions that survived did so through adaptation or institutional protection. Those that depended on private wealth to maintain their grandeur faced impossible economics. A 70-room house requires constant maintenance. Heating costs alone could bankrupt a middle-class family. The wealthy who built them were gone. The wealth itself had relocated to suburbs beyond Detroit's borders. July 23, 1967. Sunday morning. Detroit police raid an unlicensed bar on 12th Street, arresting 82 people at a welcome home party for returning Vietnam veterans. A crowd gathers. Someone throws a bottle. By noon, the city is burning. 5 days. 43 dead. Over 7,000 arrested. 1,200 buildings damaged or destroyed. Federal troops deployed to American streets. President Johnson sent in the 82nd Airborne. Tanks rolled down Woodward Avenue past the empty mansions that once symbolized prosperity. The rebellion wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of decades of police brutality, economic inequality, and political exclusion. Detroit's police force was 93% white, in a city approaching 50% black population. Police stops, searches, and arrests in black neighborhoods were routine and violent. The raid on 12th Street was standard procedure. The response was everything that had been building since Ossian Sweet defended his home 42 years earlier. The fires burned in patterns. Commercial corridors were targeted. On 12th Street, nearly every business was damaged. Looters took what they could carry. What they couldn't carry, they burned. The destruction was strategic in its own way, aimed at the economic structures that extracted wealth from the community while providing minimal services. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Between 1967 and 1970, Detroit lost 140,000 white residents. 3 years. The rate of departure increased by an order of magnitude. Businesses that survived the fires closed anyway, when their customer base vanished. Insurance companies declared entire neighborhoods uninsurable, making recovery impossible. The mansions during this period became symbols of abandonment rather than wealth. Windows were broken by looters or vandals. Copper piping was stripped and sold for scrap. Lead roofing was pried off. The houses were mined for anything with resale value, gutted from the inside while the stone facades remained. Walk through Boston Boulevard in 1970 and count the vacant properties. Plywood covers windows. Yards grow wild. Trees sprout from damaged roofs where water has penetrated. And seeds have found purchase. The transformation from monument to ruin took less than a decade in some cases. The tax base collapsed with mathematical precision. Property values fell. Assessed values fell with them. Tax revenue declined while the cost of services increased. Detroit still had to maintain infrastructure across 139 square miles, but with a shrinking budget and a population that was increasingly unable to pay. The city's response was managed retreat. Fire stations closed. Police precincts consolidated. Streetlights went dark in neighborhoods where revenue didn't justify the cost of operation. The infrastructure of municipal services contracted toward downtown and a few stable neighborhoods, abandoning the rest to accelerated decay. Some mansions were deliberately demolished. The city lacked resources to maintain vacant properties. Demolition was cheaper than securing buildings against vandalism or preventing fires in abandoned structures. The Dodge Mansion on Boston Boulevard was demolished in 1967 itself, the same year as the rebellion. Timing that was coincidental, but symbolically perfect. The Fisher Mansion survived because it had already transitioned to institutional use. The Whitney House survived because it was purchased and converted before the crisis hit. The Edsel Ford House in Grosse Pointe was never threatened because it sat safely beyond Detroit's borders, in a municipality with its own tax base and police force. By 1970, the pattern was set. The mansions that survived had institutional protection or had been converted to commercial use. Those that remained residential in neighborhoods affected by white flight faced impossible economics. No individual family could afford the maintenance. No institution wanted the liability. No developer saw profit potential in neighborhoods losing population and tax revenue. The rebellion didn't cause Detroit's decline. It accelerated a process that had been underway since 1950. But acceleration matters. What might have taken 30 years happened in 10. The exodus became a flood. The gradual decline became a collapse. And the mansions that had symbolized the fastest wealth creation in American history now symbolized the fastest urban abandonment in American history. The collapse didn't arrive in a single moment. It gathered weight over decades: population loss, industrial contraction, political fights over shrinking budget. But the 2008 financial crisis turned pressure into rupture. Detroit had endured recessions before, but this one struck at the city's two remaining pillars, the auto industry and the mortgage market. When both buckled at once, the impact wasn't symbolic. It was infrastructural, immediate, and devastating. General Motors and Chrysler entered bankruptcy within months of each other. A pair of industrial giants that once defined American manufacturing now reduced to emergency restructuring. Tens of thousands of workers faced layoffs, furloughs, or buyouts. The multiplier effect rippled across the region. Suppliers folded. Mechanics, contractors, and small business owners lost customers overnight. Neighborhoods already hollowed out by decades of decline saw the last of their economic lifelines snapped. The foreclosure crisis hit even harder. Detroit's housing market was built on fragile assumptions: old homes with low resale values, high insurance costs, aging infrastructure. When subprime lending flooded the city in the early 2000s, it offered mortgages to residents who had never been given stable credit access. When the system collapsed, entire blocks emptied. More than 1/3 of Detroit mortgages went into foreclosure. In some zip codes, the rate exceeded 50%. Houses that sold for $90,000 in 2004 were auctioned for $1,000 5 years later. Some never sold at all. By 2010, the numbers revealed a city stretched past its breaking point. Police response times averaged 58 minutes. Streetlights failed across 40% of Detroit, leaving entire neighborhoods in darkness. Firefighters used pop bottles filled with water because equipment deteriorated faster than budgets could replace it. Abandoned structures passed 78,000. Houses, factories, schools, churches, an architectural archive of a city that no longer existed. The municipal bankruptcy that followed in 2013 was unprecedented. $18 billion in debt, the largest municipal default in U.S. history. The proceedings weren't abstract accounting exercises. They determined which retirees would lose pensions, which neighborhoods would lose services, and which assets the city could sell to satisfy creditors. At stake were everything from public art to parks to city-owned buildings. The bankruptcy didn't just measure financial collapse. It revealed political priorities. Yet even in this environment of austerity and abandonment, the divide between what decayed and what survived remained sharp and revealing. Some of Detroit's most iconic Gilded Age mansions endured, not because the city saved them, but because private institutions or wealthy communities stepped in where public resources failed. The Edsel Ford House remained preserved as a museum, insulated by Grosse Pointe shores, separate tax base, and governance. Its lakefront lawns were trimmed, even as Detroit's own parks turned to scrub. The Fisher Mansion survived through conversion long before the crisis arrived, a Hare Krishna temple since the 1970s, protected by a community that maintained it even as surrounding blocks changed. A handful of Boston Boulevard mansions endured because residents refused to leave, pouring personal funds into roofs, boilers, and stonework, while entire adjacent streets emptied. Their survival wasn't accidental, it was selective, reflecting where wealth concentrated and where it evaporated. Driving through Detroit in 2013 meant witnessing this contrast block by block. On one corner stood a 3-story Renaissance revival house with intact stone columns and original leaded glass windows. Next to it, a collapsed bungalow with trees growing through the kitchen. Across the street, an empty lot where a mansion had been demolished years earlier, replaced only by weeds and the memory of a property line. The difference between what endured and what dissolved said as much about power as about neglect. Preservation required money, political connections, or institutional backing, conditions distributed unevenly across a city shaped by a century of segregation and economic flight. Some structures were protected because they sat in neighborhoods that never truly integrated into Detroit's fiscal struggles. Others survived because organizations with national donors stepped in. The rest were left to weather and time. By the time the bankruptcy concluded, Detroit had formally reorganized its finances, but the physical evidence of collapse remained embedded in the landscape. Streetlights slowly returned. Some services improved, but the ruins of pre-crisis Detroit were still visible from almost any vantage point. Shuttered schools, burned-out duplexes, mansions stripped of copper and marble, entire blocks reduced to prairie. And yet, within that landscape, pockets of survival persisted, not as celebration, but as contrast, markers of who had the resources to endure disaster and who didn't. The city's Gilded Age architecture had always been an argument about inequality. By 2013, the ruins strengthened that argument, making it impossible to ignore. Detroit's present did not emerge from a clean break with its past. It rose through a prolonged unraveling that left physical and emotional traces across 139 square miles. Today, the population sits near 639,000, a number that tells only part of the story. The real narrative lies in the empty land between surviving homes, in the fractured infrastructure, and in the architectural remains of a city that once imagined itself the industrial capital of the world. Stand in neighborhoods like Island View or Piety Hill, and the scale becomes unmistakable. Streets once lined with tightly packed homes now hold 3 or 4 occupied structures per block. The silence at night is heavy. It is not the quiet of a stable community. It is the quiet born from the absence of people who once filled these spaces with daily life. Over 65% of Detroit's peak population is gone, and the geography itself shows the imprint of that disappearance. The mansions that survive today sit as solitary guardians of earlier eras. Some remain carefully restored, protected by owners who inherited the responsibility as much as the architecture. Others carry the marks of time and abandonment. A few still bear scorch patterns from fires decades old, long extinguished but never fully repaired. And then there are the houses that became something entirely different. The Fisher Mansion, converted into a Hare Krishna temple in the 1970s, remains a rare example of a structure saved through community stewardship rather than wealth. The Whitney House, transformed into a restaurant, preserved its interior precisely because commerce allowed it to remain relevant. These buildings survived because someone had both motive and means. Many others did not. A visitor driving along Boston Boulevard today can witness 3 architectural realities at once. First, the restored mansions with manicured lawns and preserved stonework. Second, the partially rehabilitated homes that still bear the strain of deferred maintenance. Third, the empty spaces where houses once stood. Some lots have been cleared for safety. Others remain overgrown, their foundations hidden beneath brush. This juxtaposition is not accidental. It reflects which residents had the resources to resist decline and which blocks absorbed the full force of demographic and economic collapse. The demolition campaigns of the 2010s accelerated this transformation. Detroit launched aggressive blight removal efforts, tearing down more than 20,000 unsafe or abandoned structures. Supporters argued the removals cut down on fire hazards and crime. Critics noted that the demolitions sometimes erased historically significant buildings that lacked formal preservation status. In practice, it was a triage strategy. The city could not save everything. It could barely save anything without federal and state support. And so many early 20th century mansions, stripped of copper and gutted by neglect, disappeared into landfill. Their loss was quiet, bureaucratic, and nearly invisible except to the residents who watched heavy machinery erase pieces of their neighborhood's history. While neighborhoods continued to struggle, a very different story formed downtown. Billions of dollars in investment flowed into the central business district in Midtown. Corporate headquarters moved into renovated skyscrapers. Former factories were turned into lofts. Stadiums, tech offices, boutique hotels, and new restaurants changed the skyline and the visitor experience. Media outlets declared Detroit reborn. But what appeared as revival in one part of the city existed alongside persistent scarcity in others. Billionaire Dan Gilbert purchased more than 100 buildings, reshaping downtown with a single, concentrated vision. Meanwhile, on the east side, grocery stores remained scarce. Residents traveled long distances just to access fresh food. Public transit struggled to bridge the gap between reinvested areas and hollowed ones. The comeback was real for a fraction of Detroit, but uneven development created a visual and economic divide sharper than anything in the early automotive era. The mansions that still stand amplify that divide. In neighborhoods where decline has been slow but persistent, architectural treasures feel strangely disconnected from their surroundings. A Queen Anne or Tudor Revival home might remain fully intact, complete with original leaded glass and carved stone ornamentation, yet it may be surrounded by blocks of vacant land. These houses become historical markers, reminders of a period when Detroit grew faster than any American city, when wealth pooled in architectural statements meant to last centuries. Their survival in such landscapes tells a different story now, one about endurance rather than prosperity. Some of these structures are preserved through institutional protection. The Edsel Ford House in Grosse Pointe Shores remains immaculate not because of Detroit's stability, but because it sits beyond Detroit's borders in a municipality insulated from the city's fiscal collapse. Its survival reflects political boundaries as much as preservation ethics. Others survived through private determination. A few residents along Boston Boulevard maintained their homes at personal expense despite rising taxes, shrinking city services, and surrounding abandonment. Their efforts created islands of architectural continuity in an ocean of change. The ruins that remain across Detroit are more than neglected buildings. They are evidence. Each decaying school, collapsed home, and half-burned storefront is a footnote in the larger story of industrial capitalism's life cycle. The rise came quickly, the fall came faster, and the aftermath exposed how economic decisions made decades earlier continued to shape the present. Redlining did not simply exclude Black families from home ownership. It shaped which neighborhoods would receive investment and which would be abandoned during financial crises. Highway construction in the mid-20th century did not simply modernize transportation. It destroyed Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, removing cultural and economic anchors whose absence affected generations. Industrial flight did not simply reduce jobs, it hollowed the tax base that funded the city's services and schools. Detroit's remaining mansions sit within that legacy, each one a visual contradiction. They were built as celebrations of wealth, but now many survive because someone refused to surrender them to decay. They were erected during an era that believed prosperity was permanent. Their survival or destruction reveals how temporary that belief was. Yet within the emptiness of modern Detroit lies something unexpected: resilience. Community gardens bloom in lots where houses once stood. Murals stretch across abandoned factories, reclaiming walls that no longer serve their original purpose. Local organizations restore one house at a time, refusing to accept the idea that decline must be permanent. Churches maintain entire blocks by mowing vacant lots and assisting elderly residents. Block clubs enforce stability even when broader systems fail. Detroit today exists in a state of reinvention. Its comeback is real and incomplete. Its decline is visible and not absolute. The city embodies both ruin and rebuilding, both loss and possibility. And the mansions, preserved or forgotten, stand as metaphors for the larger story. They show who built wealth, who lost it, and who continues to live among the consequences. The physical remains of Detroit are not silent. They challenge every visitor to read what the stone and timber have recorded over a century. They demand acknowledgement of the choices that shaped them, and they ask a final question. As new investment reshapes parts of the city, will the lessons carried in these ruins be remembered, or will they be buried beneath a narrative of revival that does not reflect the whole truth? If this journey through Detroit's rise, unraveling, and quiet resilience meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. Stories like these remind us that cities don't fall in an instant, and they don't rise that way either. They survive because people refuse to walk away, even when the world already has.